Let us unite these rails and this great nation.
Imagine a scene, bathed in the soft light of a spring morning. The date is May 10th, 1869. We are standing at a remote, high desert plateau in Utah, known as Promontory Summit. The air, usually filled with the whisper of the wind across sagebrush, is now buzzing with a unique energy. A crowd is gathered here, in the middle of nowhere. These aren't just curious onlookers. They are the architects of a new era. They're rugged railroad workers, their faces weathered by sun and toil, standing shoulder to shoulder with impeccably dressed financiers and ambitious politicians from back east. Reporters are present, pencils poised, ready to capture the moment that will be telegraphed across the nation. Before them stands a truly remarkable sight. Two magnificent locomotives, behemoths of iron and steam, facing each other nose to nose. One is the Jupiter, locomotive number 60 of the Central Pacific Railroad, having conquered the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains from the west. The other is the number 119 of the Union Pacific Railroad, which has relentlessly pushed its way across the vast Great Plains from the east. They are like two weary giants, finally meeting after a long and arduous journey. Steam hissing softly as if they're catching their breath. The space between them is tantalizingly small, a single track length, a final gap in a chain of iron that will now bind the continent. The crowd's attention is focused on a small, yet profoundly significant object. Resting on a polished, laurelwood railroad tie is a single, gleaming spike. But this is no ordinary iron spike. It is cast from 17.6 karat gold, a symbol of the immense value and ambition poured into this continental endeavor. This is the last spike, the golden spike. It waits, catching the sunlight, ready for its singular, historic purpose. To be the final connection in the first Transcontinental Railroad. The anticipation is palpable. You can almost feel the collective heartbeat of the nation in this remote Utah wilderness. As we look upon this scene, the crowd, the engines, the gleaming spikettes, impossible not to feel the weight of history. This single moment isn't just about laying a final piece of track. It's the culmination of decades of dreams, of countless arguments in Congress, of bold visions from engineers who were told their plans were impossible. It's the result of immense sacrifice and grueling labor by thousands of workers, many of whom had crossed oceans in search of a better life, only to face unimaginable hardships building this iron road. Every swing of a pickaxe, every blast of dynamite through a mountain pass, every single rail laid across the empty plains has led to this exact point in time. This quiet summit is about to become the epicenter of a revolution, a place where the east and west coasts of a sprawling nation would finally, irrevocably, be joined together. The ceremony is about to begin. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, steps forward. He holds a silver sledgehammer, specially crafted for this occasion. The plan is simple, yet packed with symbolism. He, along with Thomas Durant from the Union Pacific, will tap the golden spike into its pre-drilled hole, completing the line. A telegraph wire is attached to the spike in the hammer, so the very moment of impact will send a message crackling across the country in real time. From New York to San Francisco, cities are waiting, ready to erupt in celebration. Cannons are primed, fire bells are ready to ring. The entire country is holding its breath, listening for a single, momentous click. But let's pause here for a moment. Before that final hammer blow falls, to truly understand the significance of this golden spike, we have to understand the journey that brought it here. This wasn't just about building a railroad. It was about taming a wilderness, uniting a nation still healing from the wounds of civil war, and unleashing an era of expansion and change that would redefine America. It was a story of incredible engineering, fierce competition, and human endurance on an epic scale. The two companies, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, were not collaborators in the traditional sense. They were rivals, locked in a frantic high-stakes race, fueled by government bonds and massive land grants. Every mile of track they laid was not just a victory over nature, but a victory over their competitor. Think of the sheer scale of the challenge. The Central Pacific, starting in Sacramento, California, had to conquer the Sierra Nevada mountains. These were granite fortresses, requiring workers, a majority of them Chinese immigrants, to blast tunnels through solid rock. Often while battling brutal blizzards and perilous avalanches, they dangled from ropes on cliff faces, chipping away at the mountainside inch by a painful inch. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific pushed westward from Omaha, Nebraska, laying track across the vast, open plains. Their challenge was one of logistics and speed. They battled harsh weather, navigated conflicts with Native American tribes whose lands this iron road was bisecting, and created massive, mobile towns of workers that moved like an army across the continent. It was a relentless, grueling push forward. And now, all of that effort, all of that human drama, has converged here. The Jupiter and the number 119 are not just machines. They are the embodiments of those two monumental efforts. They represent thousands of miles of sweat, steel, and determination. The gap between them is the final breath before a new chapter in American history begins. The golden spike is more than just a ceremonial object. It's a punctuation mark at the end of an incredible sentence, one that was written in iron across the face of a continent. It represents the promise of connection, the dawn of faster travel, and the start of the true American West. As the dignitaries prepare to strike the final blow, they are not just driving a spike. They are hammering into place the foundation of the modern United States. This single, celebrated moment is the gateway to our story. A story of how a nation was built, one railroad tie at a time. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you're fascinated by the incredible stories that shaped our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next as we dive deeper into this epic tale. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through history. In this chapter, Dreams of a Nation, we're diving into a time when the United States was a young, ambitious country, gazing westward with a mix of hope and trepidation. Picture it. The early 19th century. The original 13 colonies had become a nation, but it was a nation hemmed in by the vast, untamed wilderness stretching to the Pacific. Yet, in the minds of early American leaders and thinkers, a powerful idea was taking root. The vision of a single, unified nation spanning the entire continent, from sea to shining sea. This wasn't just a political ambition. It was a dream woven into the very fabric of the American identity. It was a belief in destiny, a sense that this great experiment in democracy was meant to grow and fill the vast, open spaces of North America. Visionaries spoke of a future where commerce, culture, and people could flow freely across thousands of miles, binding the nation together. But at the time, this was little more than a whisper, a bold and almost audacious dream against the backdrop of a continent that was still largely a mystery. The land itself was the biggest character in this story, and it held secrets, challenges, and immense potential. Then comes a pivotal moment that would change the map of America forever. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, a man of science and vision, made a decision that would double the size of the young country overnight. He orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase. For a mere $15 million, the United States acquired a staggering 828,000 square miles of territory from France. Suddenly, the dream of westward expansion wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a tangible reality. The frontier had been pushed deep into the heart of the continent. This single act unlocked a world of possibilities. It opened up new lands for settlement, new resources to be discovered, and new paths to be forged. The Mississippi River was no longer a western boundary but a central artery for a growing nation. Explorers like Lewis and Clark were dispatched to map this new territory, to understand its geography, its resources, and its inhabitants. Their journey was more than just an expedition. It was the first step in truly understanding the scale of the continent and the challenge of uniting it. The Louisiana Purchase ignited the national imagination and set the stage for the epic story of westward expansion that would define America for the rest of the century. With these vast new lands now part of the United States, a new question emerged, one that would occupy the minds of the nation's brightest engineers, politicians, and entrepreneurs for decades to come. How do you connect this sprawling continent? How do you move people, goods, and information across thousands of miles of rugged terrain? Mail could take months to cross the country by wagon or ship. A journey from New York to the newly acquired lands in the West was an arduous, dangerous, and time-consuming undertaking. The nation was growing, but it was also fragmented by distance. It was in this context that a revolutionary idea began to gain traction, an idea whispered by visionaries and early engineers, linking the East and West coasts with a railroad, a transcontinental railroad. At the time, this was a concept that bordered on science fiction. The steam locomotive was still a relatively new invention, and the idea of laying iron tracks across prairies, deserts, and formidable mountain ranges like the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada seemed almost impossible. But the dream persisted. It was a solution as grand as the problem itself, a ribbon of steel that could tie the nation together, conquer distance, and truly unify the continent. Of course, dreaming is one thing. Doing is another entirely. The challenges facing any attempt to build such a railroad were immense, almost beyond comprehension. We're talking about a continent that was still largely unmapped and untamed. The sheer scale of the landscape was breathtaking. There were vast, flat prairies that stretched to the horizon, but they were subject to extreme weather, from blistering summer heat to bone-chilling winter blizzards. There were scorching deserts with little to no water, formidable obstacles for any construction crew. And then there were the mountains. The Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada stood as colossal barriers of granite, snow, and ice. To cross them would require blasting tunnels through solid rock, building massive trestle bridges over deep canyons, and navigating treacherous passes that were often blocked by snow for months at a time. The engineering know-how was still in its infancy. How do you survey a route through such wilderness? How do you supply and feed thousands of workers in remote locations? These were not just logistical problems. They were life-or-death challenges that would test the limits of human ingenuity and endurance. Beyond the natural obstacles, there were human challenges as well. The lands of the West were not empty. They were the ancestral homes of numerous Native American tribes, whose way of life would be irrevocably altered by the coming of the Iron Horse. The political will to fund and organize such a monumental project was also a significant hurdle. It would require an unprecedented level of cooperation between the government and private industry, and it would spark intense debate and competition over the proposed route. Every city and state wanted the railroad to pass through their territory, knowing it would bring prosperity and growth. This combination of geographical barriers, technological limitations, and political complexities made the dream of a transcontinental railroad seem, to many, like a fool's errand. It was a project that would require immense capital, incredible feats of engineering, and a heavy human cost. The story of how this dream was eventually realized is a saga of ambition, innovation, conflict, and perseverance. It's a story of the thousands of individuals and surveyors, politicians, investors, and laborers from all corners of the globe who would come together to take on this impossible task. And that is where our story will pick up next. We'll explore the political battles in Washington that finally set the project in motion, the fierce rivalry between the two companies tasked with building the railroad, and the incredible human drama that unfolded as they raced to meet in the middle. The dream of a nation, born in the early days of the Republic, was about to be forged in iron and steel. It was a dream that would forever change the face of America and the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this chapter of our journey. If you're enjoying this series and want to see how this incredible story unfolds, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Your support means the world and helps us continue to bring these stories to life. We'll see you next time. Intro music fades slightly and continues in the background. Hello and welcome back to our journey through history. In our last episode, we explored the early visions and pioneering spirit that first sparked the idea of a railroad stretching across the North American continent. But an idea, no matter how grand, needs a powerful catalyst to become a reality. Today, in Chapter 3, we're heading to the year 1849 to uncover the explosive event that turned the dream of a transcontinental railroad into an urgent, undeniable necessity: the California Gold Rush. Picture this. It's January 24th, 1848. A man named James W. Marshall is working at a sawmill owned by John Sutter near Coloma, California. As he inspects the water channel, Something glitters in the morning sun. It picks it up. It's a small, gleaming nugget. Gold. At first, they try to keep it a secret. But news this big is impossible to contain. By the end of the year, a San Francisco newspaper had printed the story, and President James K. Polk himself confirmed the discovery in his address to Congress. The secret was out, and the world was listening. Suddenly, a fever swept the nation and then the globe. Gold fever, tales of instant riches, of mountains filled with gold and rivers flowing with it, spread like wildfire. For countless people, farmers tired of scratching a living from the soil, clerks dreaming of a life beyond their desks, adventurers from as far away as China, Europe, and Latin America, California, became a beacon of hope. It was the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme, a chance to change one's destiny with nothing more than a pickaxe and a prayer. And so, they came. In 1849, the migration began in earnest. These weren't just a few adventurous souls. They were an army of fortune seekers, later known as the 49ers. Over 90,000 people descended on California in that 1 year alone. The sleepy, sparsely populated territory was transformed overnight. San Francisco, once a small port town, ballooned into a bustling, chaotic city of tents and makeshift buildings, its harbor clogged with abandoned ships, as even the crews deserted to join the hunt for gold. But getting to this newfound paradise was a monumental, and often deadly, challenge. There was no easy way to get to California from the eastern United States. Hopeful miners had three main options, and none of them were for the faint of heart. The first, and seemingly most direct, was the overland route. This meant joining a wagon train and trekking more than 2,000 miles across what was then called the Great American Desert. This journey, following trails like the Oregon or California Trail, would take 4 to 6 months, if you were lucky. Families packed their entire lives into a single covered wagon, pulled by oxen or mules. They faced scorching deserts, impassable mountain ranges like the Sierra Nevada, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of disease. Cholera, dysentery, and other illnesses swept through wagon trains, often with devastating consequences. Accidents were common, from wagon rollovers to accidental gunshots. While conflicts with Native American tribes are often sensationalized in movies, the greater dangers were starvation, dehydration, and the sheer exhaustion of the journey. The trail was littered with discarded belongings and the lonely graves of those who didn't make it. The second option was the sea route, which promised to avoid the hardships of the overland trail but came with its own set of perils. For those wanting a shortcut, there was a third option: a sea voyage to the Isthmus of Panama. From there, travelers would trek through miles of dense, disease-ridden jungle to reach the Pacific coast, where they would hopefully catch another ship heading north to San Francisco. This route could cut the travel time in half, but it was arguably the most dangerous. The Panamanian jungle was swarming with mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, diseases that claimed countless lives. There was no organized transport, so travelers had to hire local guides and navigate rivers and muddy trails, all while being tormented by the heat and humidity. Reaching the Pacific side was no guarantee of success. Thousands of prospectors would often be stranded for weeks or even months, waiting for a ship with available space to take them to California. Imagine the frustration. You've sold your farm, left your family, and risked everything for a shot at a better life. But you're stuck, thousands of miles from your destination, and even further from home. Letters from loved ones could take half a year to arrive, if they arrived at all. Business transactions, government orders, and vital supplies were all subject to these same agonizing delays. The gold rush didn't just create a population boom on the West Coast. It created a crisis of connection. California was officially admitted to the Union as the 31st state in 1850. It was now part of the United States, rich in resources and growing in political importance. Yet it was almost completely isolated from the rest of the country. It was like having a vital new limb that was barely attached to the body. This isolation sparked a growing chorus of demands. Merchants in the East wanted to sell goods to the booming California market, but shipping was slow and expensive. Politicians in Washington needed to govern and administer this new territory, but communication was painfully slow. Families were desperate to stay connected with their sons, husbands, and brothers who had gone west. The nation was expanding, but its infrastructure was lagging far behind its ambitions. The cry for a solution grew louder and louder. People began to talk, write, and petition. Editorials in newspapers across the country championed the cause. We need a faster, safer, and more reliable way to connect East and West. We need a way to move people, mail, and goods across the continent in a matter of days, not months. The answer, which had once been a fantastical dream, was now starting to look like a practical, urgent necessity. They needed a railroad, a transcontinental railroad. The California gold rush provided the economic and demographic push that the idea had been missing. It was no longer just about manifest destiny or national pride. It was now about commerce, governance, and the fundamental human need for connection. The tens of thousands of people who had endured the treacherous journey west were living proof that a better way was needed. The gold they were pulling from the ground was not only building fortunes, it was building the argument for the single greatest engineering project the nation had ever conceived. The stage was now set. The demand was undeniable, the potential rewards were immense, and the national will was beginning to coalesce. But the path to building a railroad across the continent was still blocked by immense political, financial, and geographical obstacles. In our next chapter, we'll explore the political battles and the key figures who took up the fight in Washington, D.C., as they struggled to turn this urgent national need into a legislative reality. Thank you so much for joining me today. This incredible story is just getting started. So if you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter in our epic journey. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey along the rails of history. We've talked about the dream, the legislation, and the companies ready to build. Now we're heading into the wild, into Chapter 4. The first surveys. This is where the dream meets the dirt, where pen and paper plans face the unforgiving reality of the American West. The ink on the Pacific Railway Act was barely dry when the U.S. government unleashed its teams of surveyors and engineers. Their mission: to chart the unknown and find the best path for an iron road across a continent. This wasn't a Sunday stroll. It was a full-blown military-style operation. These expeditions, often led by the Army's corps of topographical engineers, or the vanguard, the first to truly measure and map the vast, challenging landscapes that lay between the settled East and the golden promise of California. Imagine these small bands of determined men, loaded with sextants, transits, and chains, venturing into territories that were, for many Americans, just blank spots on a map. They were tasked with finding not just a path, but the asterisk. Path 1 with gradual slopes, accessible water sources, and materials for construction. It was a monumental task of data collection, a quest for the perfect grade in a land of extremes. The primary adversaries weren't just the sheer distances, but the colossal mountain ranges that stood like sentinels guarding the continent's interior. First, the Rocky Mountains. This sprawling backbone of North America presented a formidable barrier. Surveyors had defined passes that were low enough to be practical for a locomotive, yet clear of the deep snows that choked the high country for much of the year. They scrambled up steep slopes, battled unpredictable weather, and navigated treacherous canyons, all while meticulously recording elevations, curvatures, and geological formations. Every potential route had its own set of problems. Some passes were too high, others too narrow. Some lead into box canyons with no escape, while others were located in regions so remote that supplying a construction crew would be a logistical nightmare. The Rockies were a giant puzzle, and the surveyors were trying to find the one combination that would unlock a path for the railroad. But if the Rockies were a puzzle, the Sierra Nevada was a fortress. This granite wall on California's eastern edge was even more intimidating. It rose abruptly from the desert floor, a sheer, seemingly impenetrable barrier of rock. The challenge here wasn't just finding a pass, but figuring out how to lay track up and over its precipitous slopes. The surveyors, like Theodore Judah, who we'll talk more about, literally had to climb these mountains, sometimes on their hands and knees, searching for any weakness, any ledge or ridge that could possibly hold a railroad. They faced dizzying heights, sheer cliffs, and the constant threat of rock slides and avalanches. The Sierra Nevada demanded not just courage, but a new level of engineering ingenuity. How do you carve a railroad bed out of solid granite? How do you build bridges over chasms thousands of feet deep? How do you protect the line from 30-foot snowdrifts? These were the questions that haunted the survey teams as they stared up at the unyielding peaks. The mountains were silent, but their challenge was loud and clear. Back in Washington and in the boardrooms of the railroad companies, the maps began to fill in. But instead of clarity, they brought more complexity. Each survey expedition returned with its own data, its own preferred route, and its own passionate arguments. The maps were a kaleidoscope of dotted lines, each one representing a different possibility, a different vision for the railroad. There was the 32nd parallel route through the desert Southwest, the 35th parallel route through Arizona and New Mexico, a central route near the 41st parallel, and a northern route through what is now Montana and Idaho. Each had its champions and its detractors. Politicians lobbied for the route that would benefit their state or territory. Engineers debated the technical merits of each pass and valley. The result was a map filled with possibilities, but no consensus. It was a cartographic battleground where geology, politics, and ambition collided. The path of the Transcontinental Railroad wasn't just being surveyed on the ground. It was being fought over on paper in a high-stakes contest to determine the future artery of the nation. For the men on the ground, the engineers and explorers, these were years of immense hardship and incredible discovery. They were more than just technicians. They were adventurers, diplomats, and survivalists. They faced blistering heat in the deserts and bone-chilling cold in the mountains. They navigated complex relationships with Native American tribes, whose lands they were charting for this new iron horse. Food and water were constant concerns. The terrain itself was a relentless opponent, breaking wagons, scattering livestock, and testing the limits of human endurance. Yet, through it all, they persevered. They were driven by a sense of national purpose, a belief in progress, and the sheer professional pride of solving one of the greatest engineering challenges of the 19th century. These weren't just lines on a map to them. They were paths they had personally walked, measured, and bled for. They were the unsung heroes who transformed the abstract idea of a transcontinental railroad into a tangible, achievable project, laying the groundwork, quite literally, for the monumental construction that was to come. Their work was the essential, grueling first step in uniting a nation with steel and steam. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of the story. The challenges were immense, but the will to succeed was even greater. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the monumental undertaking of the Transcontinental Railroad. Today, in Chapter 5, we're diving into the vision of one of America's most iconic figures, Abraham Lincoln. Long before he was president, Lincoln was a man who understood the future. As a young lawyer in Illinois, he was already deeply involved with the railroad industry, representing them in court and recognizing their immense potential to connect and grow the nation. He saw the iron horse not just as a machine, but as a vehicle for progress and prosperity. Imagine this. It's 1860, and the United States is teetering on the brink of collapse. The divisions over slavery and states' rights are deeper than ever. In this cauldron of turmoil, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. The nation he has chosen to lead is a fractured one, a house divided against itself. Within months of his inauguration, the first shots of the Civil War are fired at Fort Sumter, and the country plunges into its darkest and most bloody conflict. For any leader, just preserving the Union would have been a monumental task. But Lincoln's vision extended far beyond the battlefield. He was a statesman who could see past the immediate crises to the long-term needs of the nation. Even as the war raged, Lincoln was thinking about how to bind the country together, not just politically, but physically. He knew that to truly be, or one nation, America needed to be connected from coast to coast. The idea of a transcontinental railroad wasn't new. It had been debated for years, bogged down by sectional rivalries. Southern politicians wanted a southern route, while Northerners advocated for a northern one. The debate was a microcosm of the larger divisions plaguing the country, with the southern states seceding from the Union. This political gridlock was suddenly broken. The path was clear for a central route, something Lincoln had long favored. So, In the midst of the Civil War, on July 1st, 1862, President Lincoln did something audacious. He signed the Pacific Railway Act into law. This landmark piece of legislation authorized the construction of a railroad that would stretch from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. It was a bold, almost defiant act of nation-building. While armies clashed on an unprecedented scale, Lincoln was greenlighting one of the most ambitious engineering projects effortos in human history. The act empowered two companies, the Union Pacific, building west from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific, building east from Sacramento, California, to lay the tracks that would finally unite the continent. This wasn't just about logistics or economics for Lincoln. The railroad was a powerful symbol. In a time when the nation was literally being torn apart, the act of building something that would physically stitch it back together was a profound statement of faith in the future. It was a tangible representation of the Union that soldiers were fighting and dying to preserve. Lincoln envisioned a future where a person could travel from New York to San Francisco in a matter of days, not months. He saw a future where goods, ideas, and people could move freely across the vast expanse of the American continent, fostering a shared identity and a common purpose. The Pacific Railway Act was a masterstroke of political and economic strategy. It provided the railroad companies with massive land grants and government bonds for every mile of track they completed. This created a powerful incentive, igniting a fierce competition between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. It was a race against time, terrain, and the MTA against order. Lincoln understood the private enterprise, fueled by the promise of immense profit, but guided by national purpose, could accomplish incredible things. He was, in essence, pioneering a public-private partnership on a scale never before seen. Think about the message this sent. At a time when the very existence of the United States was in question, the government was underwriting a project that would define its future for a century to come. It was a declaration to the world, and to its own citizens, that the American experiment was not over. In fact, it was just getting started. The railroad was a promise of a post-war America, a nation healed, reunited, and stronger than ever. It was a vision of manifest destiny in stede and estime, a belief in the country's God-given right to expand and prosper from sea to shining sea. Sadly, Abraham Lincoln would not live to see his grand vision. He was assassinated in April 1865, just days after the Confederate surrender and a little over 4 years before the final golden spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah. Yet, his signature on the Pacific Railway Act set in motion the events that would culminate in that historic moment. The Transcontinental Railroad is, in many ways, one of Lincoln's most enduring legacies. It is a testament to his foresight, his optimism, and his unwavering belief in the American Union. As we move forward in our story, we will see how this vision was turned into reality by engineers, laborers, and visionaries. We will explore the immense challenges they faced and the incredible feats they accomplished. But it's crucial to remember that it all began with a president who, in the nation's darkest hour, dared to dream of a brighter, more connected future. Lincoln's vision was the blueprint, and the railroad was the magnificent structure built from it, a permanent monument to the idea of a united and indivisible nation. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of the railroad is the story of America itself, and I'm thrilled to be sharing it with you. If you're enjoying this series, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll meet the titans of industry who took Lincoln's vision and ran with it. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our series on the monumental task of building America's first transcontinental railroad. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, focusing on the story of the Union Pacific Railroad Company. If the Central Pacific had to conquer the mountains, the Union Pacific had to tame the vast, unforgiving plains. Let's set the scene. The year is 1862. The same Pacific Railroad Act that empowered the Central Pacific to build eastward from Sacramento also chartered the Union Pacific Railroad to build westward from the Missouri River. The starting point was strategically chosen. Omaha, Nebraska, a burgeoning town on the edge of the American frontier. This was the launching pad for a race against time, terrain, and a rival company hundreds of miles away. The leadership of the Union Pacific was a complex and, at times, tumultuous affair. The key figure behind the financing was Thomas C. Durant, a doctor by training but a speculator at heart. Durant was a master of finance and manipulation. He created a separate company, the Credit Mobilier of America, to handle the construction. This setup allowed him and his associates to essentially pay themselves, leading to massive profits and, eventually, one of the biggest financial scandals of the 19th century. We'll explore that scandal in more detail later. But for now, know that Durant's ambition was the engine driving the project forward, for better or for worse. On Grant, however, the real driving force was the chief engineer, Grenville M. Dodge. A former Union Army general, Dodge was a brilliant surveyor and a no-nonsense leader. He had a unique talent for logistics and an intimate knowledge of the Western landscape, gained from his time in the military. It was Dodge who mapped the route, managed the enormous workforce, and battled the immense challenges of the Great Plains. He was the practical boots-on-the-ground counterpart to Durant's financial scheming back east. The tension between these two powerful men would define much of the Union Pacific's journey. So, the company is formed, the leaders are in place, and the starting gun has been fired in Omaha. What next? The actual work of laying track. Unlike the Central Pacific, which began its monumental struggle with the Sierra Nevada mountains, immediately, the Union Pacific's initial challenge was one of sheer scale and emptiness. They were building into a vast, flat, and seemingly endless prairie. The first rails were laid in July 1865. The beginning was slow. Resources were scarce in Omaha. Every single thing needed for construction rails, ties, spikes, tools, locomotives, even food, and water for the workers had to be shipped up the Missouri River by steamboat or hauled overland by wagon. This logistical nightmare meant that in the first year, they barely made it 40 miles out of Omaha. It was a frustratingly slow start to a race they were supposed to be winning. But as the supply lines improved and the organization grew more efficient, the pace picked up. And how? The Union Pacific operation became a marvel of industrial organization, a mobile city on wheels moving across the plains. At the front was the survey crew, followed by the graders who prepared the roadbed. 10 commit to tie men, distributing thousands of wooden ties. And finally, the track-laying gangs, dropping the heavy iron rails into place and spiking them down with rhythmic efficiency. It was a well-oiled machine, and by 1866, they were laying a mile of track a day. Soon, that would become 2, and sometimes even more. At the very end of the line was the infamous Hell on Wheels. This was the name given to the collection of makeshift towns that sprang up and moved along with the railhead. These towns were a chaotic mix of saloons, gambling halls, dance halls, and stores, catering to the thousands of workers. They were rough, violent, and transient places, appearing almost overnight and disappearing just as quickly once the tracks moved on. Places like North Platte, Julesburg, and Cheyenne became legendary for their lawlessness. For the workers, Hell on Wheels was a place to spend their hard-earned pay and blow off steam after weeks of grueling labor. For the company, it was a necessary, if chaotic, part of keeping their massive workforce supplied and motivated in the middle of nowhere. Now, who were these workers? Who were the men enduring this incredible hardship? While the Central Pacific relied heavily on Chinese immigrants, the Union Pacific's workforce was a melting pot, dominated by one group in particular: Irish immigrants, thousands of Irishmen, many of them recent arrivals fleeing famine and poverty in their homeland, and many others, veterans of the recently concluded Civil War, flocked to the promise of steady work and good pay. They were known for their strength, their endurance, and their boisterous spirit. They were called Paddies, a nickname that was often derogatory but which they sometimes wore with a defiant sense of pride. These men formed the backbone of the Union Pacific. They lived in massive tent camps, worked from sunrise to sunset in all weather, and faced constant danger. The work was brutal. Lifting heavy rails, swinging sledgehammers, and grading the land by hand was physically demanding and led to countless injuries. Their diet was monotonous, often consisting of beef, bread, and coffee. Disease could sweep through the camps with devastating speed. Yet they persevered, bound by a shared sense of purpose and camaraderie. Their songs and stories became part of the legend of the railroad. But the physical labor wasn't the only challenge they faced. The Great Plains were not empty. They were the ancestral lands of powerful Native American tribes, including the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. To these tribes, the railroad was not a symbol of progress. It was an iron horse that was a profound threat. It sliced through their hunting grounds, disrupted the massive bison herds they depended on for survival, and brought a wave of settlers who had no regard for their treaties or their way of life. Naturally, they resisted. Raiding parties would attack survey crews, tear up sections of newly laid track, and derail supply trains. Workers had to be armed, and military forts were established along the route to provide protection. The conflict was brutal and tragic. For the workers, the constant threat of attack added a layer of psychological stress to their already difficult lives. For the Plains tribes, it was a desperate fight for their very existence. A fight they were ultimately destined to lose against the overwhelming power of the U.S. government and the relentless advance of the railroad. And then there was the weather. The Plains offered no protection from the elements. Summers were brutally hot, with scorching sun, choking dust, and violent thunderstorms that could turn the ground into a sea of mud. Winters were even worse. Blizzards could bury the landscape in feet of snow, bringing all work to a halt for weeks on end. Men suffered from frostbite and snow blindness. Supply lines were cut off, and crews could be stranded in the frozen wilderness. The struggle against nature was just as intense as the struggle against human adversaries. Despite all these monumental obstacles, the financial intrigue, the logistical nightmares, the harsh labor, the conflict with native tribes, and the unforgiving weather, the Union Pacific pushed onward under the relentless drive of Dodge and fueled by the sweat of thousands of immigrant workers. The line of iron rails stretched further and further west across Nebraska, into Wyoming, and over the Rocky Mountains. They were in a race, and every mile of track laid was a victory. Next time, we'll see how the two great railroad companies finally closed the gap, culminating in one of the most iconic moments in American history at Promontory Summit. The end of the race was in sight. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you're enjoying this series, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our series on the Transcontinental Railroad. Today, in Chapter 7, we re-shifting our focus westward to the other half of this colossal undertaking. The Central Pacific Railroad Company, while the Union Pacific was battling its way across the plains, another, equally ambitious company was starting from the other side, with a mountain range standing in its way. Our story begins in Sacramento, California. This bustling city, born from the gold rush, became the headquarters for a project that would redefine the American West. The year is 1861, and the idea of a railroad connecting California to the rest of the nation is no longer just a dream. It's a plan taking shape in the minds of four very determined men. These men are famously known as the Big Four, the financial titans who would bankroll and steer the Central Pacific. First, there's Leland Stanford, a successful merchant who would become the governor of California and serve as the company's president. His political influence was indispensable. Next, Collis Huntington, a shrewd hardware businessman, acted as the vice president and the company's chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He was the master negotiator, securing the funds and political support they so desperately needed. Then we have Mark Hopkins, Huntington's business partner, who was the company's treasurer. He was the meticulous one, the quiet bookkeeper who kept a close eye on every single dollar spent, ensuring the financial stability of this incredibly expensive venture. And finally, there was Charles Crocker, a former dry goods merchant with an incredible talent for organization and management. He would head the construction subsidiary, Charles Crocker & Co., and take on the monumental task of actually building the railroad. These four men, though different in personality, shared a common vision and an iron will to see it through. They broke ground in Sacramento in January 1863, with much ceremony and fanfare. But the initial progress was painfully slow. Unlike the Union Pacific, which had relatively flat terrain to start with, the Central Pacific faced a formidable obstacle almost immediately. the Sierra Nevada mountains. This wasn't just a range of hills. This was a 70-mile-wide wall of solid granite, with peaks soaring over 7,000 feet. Building a railroad through this was considered by many to be impossible. The initial years were a grueling slog. Every piece of equipment, from locomotives and rails to the very spikes that held them down, had to be shipped from the East Coast. This wasn't a simple journey. The cargo had to travel 18,000 miles by sea, all the way around Cape Horn at the tip of South America. A perilous and time-consuming voyage that could take months. The alternative, shipping across the Isthmus of Panama, was faster but far more expensive. This logistical nightmare meant that the Central Pacific was always short on supplies and facing immense costs from the very beginning. Another massive problem was labor. The California gold rush had created a transient population, and finding reliable, long-term workers was incredibly difficult. Many men would sign up, work for a short time, and then disappear, lured by the promise of striking it rich in the nearby silver mines of Nevada. The workforce was unstable, and construction fell further and further behind schedule. Charles Crocker was getting desperate. How could they build a railroad without a reliable army of workers? The solution came from an unexpected source. Crocker suggested hiring Chinese immigrants. Initially, this idea was met with intense skepticism and prejudice. The foreman, James Strobridge, was adamantly against it, believing they were too small and lacked the physical strength for such demanding work. But desperation forced their hand. In 1865, they decided to run a trial, hiring an initial group of 50 Chinese laborers. The results were stunning. The Chinese workers proved to be tireless, disciplined, and incredibly efficient. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. They were organized, saved their money, and maintained their own camps, providing their own food and lodging. They were less prone to the drinking and fighting that plagued other labor camps. Most importantly, they worked. Soon, the Central Pacific was actively recruiting thousands of men directly from China. They sent agents to the Guangdong province, promising steady work and pay. Over the next few years, between 12,000 and 15,000 Chinese immigrants would form the backbone of the Central Pacific's workforce. They made up over 80% of the entire labor force. Yet their contribution was, for a long time, tragically overlooked by history. With a dependable workforce in place, the assault on the Sierra Nevada began in earnest. This was one of the greatest engineering challenges of the 19th century. They couldn't go around the mountains. They had to go through them. The work was brutal and dangerous. Men were lowered down sheer cliff faces in wicker baskets, hundreds of feet in the air. Their job was to hand-drill holes into the solid granite, pack them with black powder or the volatile new explosive, nitroglycerin, light the fuse, and then frantically be pulled up before the blast. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Landslides, premature explosions, and the sheer unforgiving nature of the terrain claimed hundreds of lives. And then there was the weather. The winters in the high Sierras were savage. Snow could fall dozens of feet deep, burying entire work camps. They had to build massive wooden snow sheds to protect the tracks, but even getting to the work site was a battle. They dug tunnels through 40-foot snowdrifts just to move between their living quarters and the tunnel entrances. In the winter of 1866 to 1867, avalanches were a constant threat, sweeping away camps and crews without warning. Despite these hellish conditions, the workers persevered. The most difficult section was the Summit Tunnel, a 1,659-foot-long tunnel that had to be carved through solid granite at an elevation of over 7,000 feet. To speed up the process, they worked from both ends of the tunnel and also sank a central shaft down from the surface, allowing them to blast outward from the middle as well. For over a year, they drilled, blasted, and cleared rubble, inching their way through the mountain 24 hours a day. Finally, in August 1867, they broke through. The hardest part was over. The workers of the Central Pacific had conquered the Sierra Nevada. It was a monumental achievement, a testament to human ingenuity and, above all, the incredible endurance and sacrifice of the Chinese laborers who made it possible. With the mountains behind them, the race across the Nevada and Utah deserts was on. The finish line was getting closer, and the stage was set for the final dramatic push to meet the Union Pacific. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our journey. The story of the Central Pacific is one of incredible grit and determination against seemingly impossible odds. If you enjoyed this video and want to see how this epic race concludes, please hit that like button and make sure you resubscribe with notifications turned on so you won't miss the next chapter. We truly appreciate your support. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 8, The Life of the Railroad Workers. We've talked about the engineering marvels and the economic impact. But what about the people? The ones who laid every tie, hammered every spike, and blasted through every mountain. This is their story. Let's start by setting the scene. Imagine waking up before dawn. The air, sharp and cold. You're in a makeshift camp, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by the raw, untamed wilderness of 19th century America. This was the daily reality for tens of thousands of workers, primarily immigrants from Ireland and China, who formed the backbone of the Transcontinental Railroad's workforce. The Irish workers, many of whom had fled the Great Famine, were predominantly employed by the Union Pacific, building westward from Omaha. They were known for their brawn and resilience, taking on the grueling task of laying mile after mile of track across the vast, open plains. Their work was physically demanding, a relentless cycle of grading the land, hauling heavy iron rails, and driving spikes with rhythmic, powerful swings of a 10-pound sledgehammer. It was a race against time, with crews competing to lay the most track in a single day. On the other side of the continent, the Central Pacific faced an even more formidable challenge: the Sierra Nevada mountains. For this monumental task, they turned to Chinese immigrants. Initially, there was skepticism about their ability to handle such strenuous labor, but they quickly proved to be exceptionally diligent, reliable, and incredibly brave. The Chinese workers became the masters of the most dangerous jobs, particularly the blasting of tunnels through solid granite. Picture this. You're suspended in a wicker basket, hundreds of feet down the face of a sheer cliff. Your job is to hand drill a hole into the rock, pack it with black powder, light a fuse, and then signal to be hauled up as quickly as possible before the explosion. Timing was everything. A moment too late, and the consequences were fatal. The courage and precision required for this task are almost unimaginable today. They chipped away at the mountains, inch by agonizing inch, opening a path for the railroad where none seemed possible. The working conditions for both groups were brutal. In the summer, they endured blistering heat on the plains and in the desert, with little water and shade. In the winter, especially in the Sierras, they faced Arctic temperatures and monumental snowstorms. Workers had to dig tunnels through snowdrifts that were over 40 feet high just to get to their work sites. Avalanches were a constant, deadly triads sometimes burying entire camps and their inhabitants, who wouldn't be found until the spring thaw. Life in the camps was as harsh as the work itself. For the Union Pacific's Irish workers, the camps were temporary, mobile cities that followed the tracks. These hell-on-wheels towns were rough, lawless places, filled with saloons and gambling dens. It was a world of hard work, hard living, and often hard drinking. The diet was monotonous, typically consisting of beef, bread, and coffee. It was sustenance, but little more. The Chinese workers on the Central Pacific side maintained a different lifestyle. Their camps were known for being more orderly and clean. They were meticulous about hygiene, boiling their water for tea, which helped them avoid many of the diseases like dysentery that plagued other camps. Their diet was also more varied and arguably healthier. They imported dried oysters, vegetables, and other familiar foods from China. After a long day's work, they would relax with a game of cards, or simply share stories from their homeland, creating a community in the midst of the wilderness. They kept their culture alive, a small comfort so far from home. But this story of progress is also a story of immense human cost. The railroad was built on the sweat and sacrifice of these men. Accidents were tragically common. Explosions, rock slides, construction mishaps, and disease claimed an untold number of lives. Records from the era are incomplete, but it's estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of workers perished. For the Chinese workers, in particular, the death toll was horrifically high. There's a somber saying from that time: Beneath every tie lies a railroad worker. It's a haunting reminder of the lives that were literally laid down to connect a nation. These workers, both Irish and Chinese, faced not only the dangers of the job but also prejudice and discrimination. They were paid less than their American-born counterparts and were often viewed as expendable. Yet, their contribution is undeniable. They overcame linguistic barriers, cultural differences, and unimaginable hardships to achieve one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century. Their legacy isn't just in the iron rails that still cross the country. It's in the story of America itself, a story of immigration, of hard work, of sacrifice, and of the pursuit of a better life. They were the anonymous heroes who built a nation, spike by spike. When we look at the Transcontinental Railroad, we shouldn't just see a line on a map. We should see the faces of the thousands of individuals who poured their lives into its creation. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. It's so important to remember the human stories behind the great events of history. If you found this chapter as moving as I did, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might appreciate it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey along the tracks of history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, where we'll uncover the breathtaking technology and engineering marvels that made the Transcontinental Railroad a reality. This wasn't just about laying track. It was a monumental battle of human ingenuity against the raw, untamed power of nature. Imagine standing at the base of the Sierra Nevada or the Rocky Mountains. These weren't just hills, they were colossal barriers of solid granite. How do you carve a path through that? The answer was explosive. Crews, often suspended precariously on cliff sides, would drill holes into the rock, pack them with nitroglycerin or black powder, light a fuse, and scramble for cover. Boom! With each blast, they chipped away at the impossible, creating tunnels foot by painful foot. The Summit Tunnel, for instance, at over 1,600 feet long, was bored through solid granite at an elevation of more than 7,000 feet. It was dangerous, deafening work, a constant dance with death, but it was the only way through. Once they conquered the mountains, they faced a new challenge. The vast, unpredictable chasms and valleys that crisscrossed the landscape. Rivers raged and canyons plunged hundreds of feet deep. The solution? Wooden These weren't just simple bridges. They were engineering masterpieces. Intricate spider webs of timber that seemed to defy gravity. Pictured massive wooden structures, some stretching for hundreds of feet and rising over 100 feet high, built with nothing more than lumber, sweat, and sheer determination. The Dale Creek Trestle in Wyoming, for example, was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. A 700-foot-long wooden bridge, swaying 150 feet above the creek. Crossing it was a true test of nerve for engineers and passengers alike. These trestles were the lifelines that stitched the two ends of the continent together, allowing the iron horse to stride over impossibly deep voids. But the real heart of this operation was the track itself. This was a race, a frantic, relentless push to lay more miles of track each day than the rival company. This competition sparked incredible innovations in speed and efficiency. An entire ecosystem on wheels, known as Hell on Wheels, moved with the track layers. It was a mobile city, complete with supply cars, sleeping quarters, kitchens, and blacksmith shops. The process became a choreographed ballet of brute force. A team would grade the land, followed by crews laying wooden ties. Then came the ironmen, who would haul the heavy steel rails, each weighing over 500 pounds, and spike them into place. At their peak, crews could lay an astonishing 10 miles of track in a single day, a record that still stands as a testament to their organization and endurance. This wasn't just construction, it was a military-style campaign, executed with precision and relentless forward momentum. So, when we look at the map of the Transcontinental Railroad, we're not just seeing lines on a page. Each and every mile represents a story, a triumph over nature's greatest obstacles. Every tunnel bored through a mountain was a victory against solid rock. Every trestle spanning a canyon was a testament to human courage and design. And every steel rail spiked into the ground was a symbol of an unwavering belief in progress and a connected future. The railroad wasn't just built, it was wrestled from the wilderness through sheer will, innovation, and an incredible amount of hard work. It stands today as one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, a permanent mark of what we can accomplish when we dare to dream big. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible chapter of our story. The engineering genius behind this project is truly something to behold. If you found this as fascinating as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. And do yon forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do yon miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on the monumental construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Last time, we talked about the incredible feats of engineering and the sheer determination that pushed the tracks forward. But today, in Chapter 10, we're diving into the darker, more turbulent side of this story. The conflicts and challenges that nearly derailed the entire project. Building a railroad across a continent wasn't just about laying track. It was a massive, chaotic undertaking that created its own storms. Let's start with the workforce. Thousands of laborers, from Irish immigrants to Chinese workers, toiled under brutal conditions for meager pay. They faced scorching deserts, frozen mountains, and constant danger. It was only a matter of time before they demanded better. Labor disputes became a common and disruptive force. Imagine being thousands of miles from home, blasting through solid rock for pennies an hour, while the company owners get rich. The frustration was palpable. Strikes erupted along the line. Workers would drop their tools, demanding higher wages, safer conditions, and better food. These weren't peaceful protests. They were desperate acts of survival. The companies, like the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, often responded with force, hiring strikebreakers or cutting off food supplies to starve the workers back to their posts. This created a cycle of resentment and conflict that simmered constantly beneath the surface of progress. The very hands building the railroad were often locked in a bitter struggle against the minds financing it. But the conflict wasn't just internal. As the iron rails pushed westward, they sliced directly through lands that had been home to Native American tribes for centuries. For the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Arapaho, and others, the railroad wasn't a symbol of progress. It was an invasion. It was the Iron Horse, a loud, smoky beast that scared away the bison, their primary source of food, clothing, and shelter. The railroad brought settlers, hunters, and soldiers, all of whom threatened their way of life. So, they fought back. They defended their lands with incredible bravery and skill. Warriors would attack survey crews, raid construction camps, and even attempt to derail the trains themselves. They saw the railroad for what it was, an existential threat. These were not random acts of aggression. They were calculated acts of resistance by a people fighting for their survival. The U.S. Army was deployed to protect the railroad, leading to a series of brutal and tragic conflicts across the plains. Every mile of track laid was a mile of land lost, and the cost was measured not just in dollars, but in lives and displaced cultures. Beyond the battlefield and the labor camps, there was another war being waged, a logistical one. Think about the sheer scale of it all. Every single rail, every spike, every wooden tie, every sledgehammer, and every barrel of black powder had to be transported thousands of miles. The Union Pacific was laying track across the vast, empty plains, where the nearest tree could be hundreds of miles away. Supplies had to be brought in by riverboat and wagon train, a slow and expensive process. Running out of materials meant the entire project would grind to a halt, with thousands of workers sitting idle while the costs mounted. And what about money? The project was phenomenally expensive. Both companies were constantly on the brink of financial collapse, lobbying furiously in Washington for more government bonds and land grants. The financial struggle was a relentless, high-stakes game. A delay in funding, a bad winter that halted supply lines, or a spike in the price of iron could spell disaster. It was a daily battle against distance, nature, and the bottom line. And where there's that much money, that much power, and that much government involvement, corruption is never far behind. This brings us to one of the biggest scandals of the 19th century. The railroad companies were not just engineering marvels. They were also vehicles for immense personal enrichment. The most infamous example was the Credit Mobilier of America scandal. Hear us how it worked. The key investors in the Union Pacific Railroad also created a separate construction company called Credit Mobilier. They then used their power within the railroad to award incredibly inflated contracts to their own construction company. Essentially, they were overpaying themselves with money that was largely coming from government bonds and other investors. They were building the railroad for one price and charging the government a much, much higher one, pocketing the difference. To keep the scheme going and prevent Congress from investigating, they distributed shares of Credit Mobilier stock to influential politicians, basically bribing them to look the other way. When the scandal finally broke, it was explosive. It implicated congressmen, senators, and even the Vice President of the United States. It exposed a deep rot of fraud and corruption at the heart of this great national project, tarnishing its image and revealing how the pursuit of progress was entangled with greed. So, as we look at the finished railroad, it's crucial to remember these conflicts. The story isn't just about triumph and unity. It's also a story of exploitation, of violent clashes, of desperate logistical struggles, and of staggering corruption. These challenges tested the limits of everyone involved and left deep scars on the nation's landscape and its conscience. The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't just built with iron and wood. It was forged in conflict. Thanks for joining me for this chapter. The story is complex, and it's important we remember all sides of it. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you then. Welcome, bike history buffs and adventurers, to our ongoing saga of the Transcontinental Railroad. Today, we dive into Chapter 11, Pushing Across the Plains. If you thought the journey so far was tough, you haven't seen anything yet. We're joining the Union Pacific as they charge headfirst into the vast, untamed wilderness of Nebraska and Wyoming. Imagine this. You're out there, under a sky so big it feels like it could swallow you whole. The only sounds are the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel, the shouts of your fellow workers, and the whistle of the wind. This wasn't just construction. It was a battle against the elements, a daily test of human endurance. The goal: to lay 10 miles of track in a single day, a feat that seemed impossible. But for these crews, impossible was just another challenge to be conquered. The Great Plains were a land of extremes. One day, the sun would beat down relentlessly, baking the earth and the men who worked it. The next, a terrifying prairie storm would roll in, with lightning that split the sky and thunder that shook the very ground you stood on. These weren't just rain showers. They were cataclysmic events that could halt all progress, turning the worksite into a sea of mud and chaos. The workers had to be as tough as the land they were taming, ready to face whatever nature threw at them. And then there were the buffalo, not just a few, but herds so massive they defy modern imagination. Picture a sea of brown, shaggy beasts stretching from horizon to horizon, numbering in the millions. When these herds decided to cross the tracks, everything stopped. There was no arguing with the force of nature that powerful. The ground would tremble as they passed, a thunderous, living river that could take hours, sometimes even days, to cross. For the workers, it was a moment of awe, a humbling reminder of the wild world they were slicing through with their iron ribbon. But the natural world wasn't the only danger. The plains were the ancestral home of Native American tribes, and the railroad, this iron horse, was a direct threat to their way of life. It disrupted a world that had existed for centuries, and tensions were incredibly high. To protect the construction crews from raids and skirmishes, the U.S. Army was brought in. Soldiers, many of them veterans of the Civil War, became a constant presence, riding alongside the track layers, their rifles at the ready. These army escorts created a kind of moving fortress. Surveyors, graders, and track layers worked under the watchful eye of armed guards. It was a strange, intense partnership. The soldiers were there to provide security, but their presence also highlighted the conflict at the heart of this great expansion. Every spike driven into the ground was not just a step forward for the railroad, but also a deeper intrusion into lands that were not empty, but were, in fact, somebody's home. The sound of a hammer was a sound of progress to some, and a sound of invasion to others. Despite all these hardships, the brutal weather, the wildlife encounters, the constant threat of conflict, there was an undeniable sense of relentless progress. You could feel it in the air. Every morning, the crews would push out from their hell-on-wheels towns, those temporary cities of tents and shacks that followed the end of the track. And every evening, they would look back and see miles of new gleaming rails stretching behind them, a tangible monument to their day's labor. This wasn't just about building a railroad. It was about building a nation. It was about connecting East and West, about fulfilling the dream of manifest destiny. The men who worked on the Union Pacific, from the Irish immigrants to the Civil War vets, were driven by more than just a paycheck. They were part of something monumental, something that would change the face of America forever. There was a raw, powerful momentum to their work, a feeling that they were a locomotive themselves, pushing unstoppably across the plains. The sheer scale of the operation is hard to comprehend. Think about the logistics. Every single rail, every spike, every wooden tie had to be transported from the east. Food, water, and supplies for thousands of men had to be shipped out to what was essentially the middle of nowhere. It was a massive, mobile industrial operation, a testament to American ingenuity and organizational might. The end of the track was a hive of activity, a symphony of organized chaos, all focused on one single purpose: moving forward. As the Union Pacific pushed deeper into Wyoming, the landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills and, eventually, the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The challenges evolved. The graders had to blast through rock and build up massive earthen fills. To keep the track level, it was a constant fight against a landscape that didn't want to be tamed. Yet, day by day, mile by mile, Tay advanced. This relentless drive, this spirit of overcoming any obstacle, is the defining feature of this chapter of the story. It was a time of incredible hardship, but also of incredible achievement. The men who pushed the railroad across the plains were not just laborers. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word, facing down a continent and bending it to their will. Their story is a powerful reminder of what humans are capable of when united by a common, ambitious goal. Join us next time as we tackle the next great obstacle: the unforgiving Rocky Mountains. The challenges are about to get even bigger. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this epic American story. We'll see you on the next leg of the journey. Welcome back to our series on the monumental construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Today, in Chapter 12, we're tackling the most formidable obstacle yet: conquering the Sierra Nevada. Imagine standing at the foot of a granite giant, a wall of rock stretching thousands of feet into the sky. This was the challenge facing the Central Pacific Railroad as they pushed eastward from California. Their goal seemed impossible: to lay track through one of the most rugged mountain ranges on Earth. The year is 1865. The easy, flat terrain of the Sacramento Valley is behind them. Now, the real battle begins. Every inch of progress has to be carved, blasted, and dug from solid rock, the primary weapon in this war against the mountains. Black powder. Lots of it. Crews of workers, many of them Irish immigrants, would drill holes into the unforgiving granite, sometimes only making a few inches of progress in a full day's work. They'd pack these holes with black powder, light the fuses, and run for cover as the explosions echoed through the canyons. It was slow, dangerous, and deafening work. The mountainside would roar to life, showering the area with stone and debris. Once the dust settled, the men would rush back in with shovels and pickaxes to clear the rubble, preparing for the next blast, the next inch forward. But black powder was often not enough. The granite of the Sierra Nevada was incredibly dense, and progress was agonizingly slow. The railroad's chief engineer, Theodore Ruda, had scouted a path, but turning his vision into reality required something more powerful. Enter nitroglycerin. This highly unstable, liquid explosive was a game-changer. But it came at a terrible cost. It was about 13 times more powerful than black powder, capable of shattering rock that had previously seemed unbreakable. However, it was also notoriously dangerous to transport and handle. Accidents were frequent and devastating. It earned a grim nickname among the workers, who knew that any mistake could be their last. Yet, the pressure to advance was relentless. The company needed to conquer the mountains, and nitroglycerin, despite its dangers, was the key. As the Central Pacific clawed its way higher into the mountains, a new and even more relentless enemy appeared. Winter. The Sierra Nevada is famous for its brutal snowstorms, and the winters of the 1860s were some of the most severe on record. Snow began to fall in October and didn't stop for months. It buried everything. Campsites vanished under 20-foot drifts. The tracks they had just laid disappeared completely. Entire locomotives were encased in snow and ice. The work didn't stop, though. It couldn't. The race against the Union Pacific was on. To continue, the workers had to become mole men, digging a labyrinth of tunnels and snow sheds, not through rock, but through the massive snowpack itself, just to get from their buried cabins to the worksite. Imagine living and working in a world of white. The snow was so deep that they had to build temporary towns underneath it. They carved tunnels connecting their living quarters to the areas where they were blasting through the rock face. Air shafts were dug up through 40 or 50 feet of snow just to provide ventilation. The threat of avalanches was constant. A low rumble in the distance could signal a wall of snow thundering down the mountain, capable of sweeping away men, equipment, and entire camps in an instant. It was a harrowing existence, a constant fight against both the mountain's rock and its weather. They built over 37 miles of wooden snow sheds to protect the tracks, creating a long, dark tunnel that would allow trains to pass even in the harshest winter storms. It was in these extreme conditions that the incredible perseverance of the Chinese laborers truly shone. By 1867, they made up the vast majority of the Central Pacific's workforce, over 12,000 men. Recruited from China, they arrived to face not only the brutal work and harsh climate, but also intense prejudice. They were paid less than their white counterparts, and were often given the most dangerous jobs. Yet, they proved to be exceptionally disciplined, organized, and resilient. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, in conditions that many others found unbearable. Their diet of tea, rice, and dried vegetables, which they paid for themselves, kept them healthier than the other workers, who often suffered from scurvy. The Chinese crews became masters of their craft. They were organized into efficient teams, each with a cook and a leader. They were particularly skilled at the perilous task of blasting. In some of the most dramatic feats of engineering on the line, Chinese workers were lowered down sheer cliff faces in woven baskets, dangling hundreds of feet in the air. They would hand drill holes into the granite, plant their explosives, light the fuse, and then signal frantically to be pulled up before the blast. The timing had to be perfect. A slight delay could be fatal. It was through this breathtaking courage and tireless effort that they carved ledges like Cape Horn, where the track would cling precariously to the side of a vertical drop. The sheer cliffs and deep ravines of the Sierra Nevada required more than just blasting. They demanded the construction of massive wooden trestles. These spindly-looking but incredibly strong structures were built to span canyons and gorges, allowing the track to maintain a steady grade. Workers, many of them Chinese, would clamber over the timber frameworks, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, with no safety nets or modern equipment. They used simple hand tool saws, axes, and hammers to assemble these colossal structures piece by piece. The trestles were a testament to their bravery and skill, temporary bridges that allowed the railroad to march relentlessly forward. Each one was a race against time, built with the knowledge that thousands of tons of steel and machinery would soon be rolling across their handiwork. Perhaps the crowning achievement of this mountain conquest was the Summit Tunnel. At an elevation of over 7,000 feet, this was the highest point on the line, and it required tunneling through 1,659 feet of solid granite. Work began on this tunnel from both ends, with crews hoping to meet in the middle. When winter snows blocked the eastern approach, the railroad superintendent had a brilliant, if audacious, idea. He had workers drag a locomotive rails and equipment over the summit on sleds, allowing them to start work on the eastern side of the tunnel and continue laying track down into the Nevada desert even while the tunnel itself was still being built. Meanwhile, to speed up the work, they also started digging from the center of the tunnel by first blasting a vertical shaft down from the summit, then digging outwards in both directions. This meant they were attacking the tunnel from 4 faces at once. For over a year, the sound of hammers and explosions never ceased, 24 hours a day, as men worked by candlelight deep inside the mountain. Finally, In August of 1867, the two ends of the summit tunnel met. The alignment was off by only a couple of inches on. Incredible feat of engineering for the time. The breakthrough was a massive victory. They had broken the back of the Sierra Nevada. With the mountains conquered, the Central Pacific could now race across the much flatter terrain of the Great Basin, laying miles a track per day in their sprint to meet the Union Pacific. The story of their struggle, the blasts, the snows, the tunnels, and the sheer human will remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in American history. It was a victory won by the sweat, courage, and sacrifice of thousands of unsung heroes who battled a mountain and won. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through the Sierra Nevada. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is full of moments like these, where human ingenuity and determination overcame seemingly impossible odds. If you found this chapter as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. We've got a lot more ground to cover. We'll see you in the next video. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our series on the Transcontinental Railroad. Today, we're diving into Chapter 13, The Race to the Meeting Point. If you thought building a railroad across America was just about laying track, think again. This was one of the most intense, high-stakes races in American history. A story of ambition, rivalry, and sheer human will. Picture this: the late 1860s. The Civil War is over, and the nation is looking westward, dreaming of manifest destiny. Two companies, the Central Pacific, pushing east from Sacramento, California, and the Union Pacific, driving west from Omaha, Nebraska, are at the heart of this dream. Their mission, to connect the country by rail. But this wasn't a friendly collaboration. It was a full-blown competition, fueled by pride, profit, and patriotism. So, what was driving this incredible rivalry? The answer is simple: money and land. The U.S. government, desperate to see the railroad completed, came up with a brilliant, if slightly chaotic, incentive plan. For every single mile of track a company laid, the government would grant them a generous subsidy in the form of bonds and massive tracts of land alongside the tracks. We're talking thousands of dollars and thousands of acres for every mile. The more track you laid, the richer your company became. Suddenly, it wasn't just about connecting the coasts. It was about laying more track than the other guy. This incentive lit a fire under both companies. The race was on, and it turned the construction into a spectacle of speed and endurance. The pace became absolutely frantic. This wasn't careful, methodical work anymore. It was a mad dash. Foremen pushed their crews from sunrise to sunset, and sometimes even by lamplight, to gain just a few more feet, a few more yards, another precious mile. Every day was a battle against the clock, against the terrain, and against the rival company creeping ever closer from the opposite direction. The Union Pacific, with its relatively flat terrain across the Great Plains, had the early advantage. Led by the determined Grenville Dodge, their crews, made up largely of Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, became masters of efficiency. They organized their process like a military operation. A forward team graded the land, followed by teams laying the ties. Then the heavy iron rails were dropped into place, and finally, the spikers hammered them down in a rhythmic chorus of steel on steel. They created a moving city, a hell on wheels as it was called, that followed the end of the track, complete with saloons, gambling halls, and all the chaos of a frontier boomtown. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific, under the leadership of the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Calise Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, faced a much more daunting challenge. The Sierra Nevada mountains, blasting through solid granite, building massive trestles over deep chasms, and battling brutal winter snows that could bury work sites under dozens of feet of snow. Their progress was painstakingly slow at first. Their workforce, primarily made up of thousands of resilient Chinese laborers, performed incredible feats of engineering and courage. They were the unsung heroes, dangling from cliffs in wicker baskets to drill holes for dynamite. As the Union Pacific blazed across the plains, the pressure on the Central Pacific mounted. Charles Crocker, the man in charge of construction, was relentless. He famously told his crews he wanted a mile of track for every day of the week. It seemed impossible, but the drive to keep up, to not let the Union Pacific win the race to the lucrative Salt Lake Basin, was all-powerful. They perfected their techniques, and once they broke free from the mountains, they started laying track at a speed that stunned the nation. By 1868, both railroads were tearing toward Utah, the designated meeting ground. The Great Plains were behind the Union Pacific, and the Sierras were conquered by the Central Pacific. Now, it was a sprint across the relatively flat terrain of the Great Basin. The competition reached a fever pitch. Surveying crews from both companies actually overlapped, grading parallel lines just a few hundred feet from each other. Can you imagine the scene? Two massive construction armies, working in sight of one another, each trying to outdo the other. It was a chaotic and expensive duplication of effort, all for the sake of claiming a few more miles of government subsidies. This final leg of the race saw some of the most legendary achievements of the entire project. The rivalry became personal. In a legendary display of pride and prowess, Charles Crocker of the Central Pacific wagered that his men could lay an astonishing 10 miles of track in a single day. The Union Pacific had boasted of laying 7.5 miles, a record at the time. Crocker was determined to smash it. On April 28, 1869, a hand-picked crew of Irish and Chinese workers set out to do the impossible. In a perfectly choreographed 12-hour effort, they laid an incredible 10 miles and 56 feet of track. It was a record that has never been broken, a testament to the sheer determination fueled by this incredible race. As they closed in on each other in Utah, the government finally had to step in. The parallel grading was wasteful, and the nation was eager for the line to be completed. Congress declared that the official meeting point would be Promontory Summit, Utah. The race was finally over. The finish line had been set. All that remained was for the two iron horses to meet, and for a nation to celebrate the monumental achievement that this frantic, competitor, and all-inspiring race had produced. This incredible chapter of American history shows us how competition can fuel unbelievable innovation and effort. It was a race that defined a generation and physically united a nation. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you not miss our final chapter where we'll witness the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit. See you next time. Video opens with visuals of a steam train chugging along a track, with telegraph poles running parallel to it. The sound of a telegraph key clicking can be heard softly in the background. Hello and welcome back to our journey through the forces that shaped the modern world. Today, we're diving into Chapter 14, Telegraphs and Communication. Imagine a time when a message from New York to San Francisco could take months, traveling by wagon or ship. Now, picture this. Suddenly, that same message could cross the continent in a matter of minutes. This wasn't magic. It was the telegraph, the Victorian era's internet. As the iron horses of the Transcontinental Railroad began to stitch the nation together, another, more silent revolution was happening right alongside them. Along nearly every mile of new track, crews were also raising tall wooden poles and stringing miles upon miles of single iron wire. These weren't just support structures for the railway. They were the physical backbone of a new nervous system for the entire continent. The railroad and the telegraph were partners in progress, a powerful duo that would forever change the American landscape and the very perception of time and distance. This synergy was no accident. The telegraph was indispensable for the safe and efficient operation of the railroads. Think about it. A single track stretching for hundreds of miles through the wilderness. How do you prevent two trains heading towards each other from meeting in a disastrous collision? How do you coordinate schedules, report delays, or request assistance in remote areas? The telegraph was the answer. Station masters could tap out messages, sending real-time information about train movements up and down the line. It was the original air traffic control. But for the ground, this constant stream of communication allowed for a level of coordination and safety that would have been impossible otherwise, making the monumental task of running a transcontinental railroad manageable. But the telegraph's impact stretched far beyond the rails. It was the birth of instant, long-distance communication. Before the telegraph, information traveled at the speed of the fastest horse or steamship, a business deal, a family emergency, or a major news event would be old news by the time it reached the other side of the country. The telegraph shattered this limitation. Suddenly, a merchant in St. Louis could get the latest market prices from Chicago in real time. A family in Boston could learn of a loved one's safe arrival in a distant western town almost instantly. This was a fundamental shift in how people lived, worked, and perceived the world around them. The sound of the clicking key became the heartbeat of this new era. It was a language of its own Morse code, a series of dots and dashes that, in the hands of a skilled operator, could convey complex thoughts and urgent news. These telegraph operators were the unsung heroes of this communication revolution. Often stationed in small, isolated depots in the middle of nowhere, they were the critical link, the human nodes in this vast electronic network. They translated the world into electrical pulses and back again, connecting disparate communities with the invisible thread of information. This newfound connectivity created a profound psychological shift. The continent, once a vast and imposing expanse that took months to cross, suddenly felt smaller, more manageable, more connected. News of national importance, which once trickled slowly across the land, now spread like wildfire. A presidential election, a major battle in the Civil War, or a gold strike in the mountains, everyone could learn about it at roughly the same time. This shared, simultaneous experience fostered a new sense of national identity. People in California and Maine could read the same news on the same day, creating a unified public consciousness that hadn't existed before. The country wasn't just physically linked by rail. It was now mentally and socially linked by wire. One of the most fascinating aspects of this technological rollout is that in many cases, the telegraph lines actually outpaced the trains. As survey crews and construction gangs pushed westward, laying the groundwork for the railroad, the telegraph wires followed closely behind, and sometimes even went ahead. This meant that remote frontier towns and construction camps, long before they heard the first whistle of an approaching locomotive, were already plugged into this national network. They were no longer completely isolated. They could send for supplies, report on progress, and stay connected to the eastern hubs of power and commerce. The telegraph was the advanced scout of modernity, announcing the arrival of a new, interconnected age even before the physical transport arrived. Think about what that meant for the people on the frontier. They were pioneers, living in rugged and often dangerous conditions. But they weren't entirely cut off. The telegraph was their lifeline. It brought a sense of security and a connection to the civilization they had left behind. It was a tangible sign that they were part of a larger, growing nation, even from their distant outpost. This connection helped fuel the momentum of westward expansion, making the prospect of moving to these new territories a little less daunting. As the network expanded, it became the lifeblood of commerce. Stock tickers, a specialized form of telegraph, clattered away in brokerage houses, printing stock prices on ribbons of paper and creating a truly national market. Businesses could place orders, confirm shipments, and manage their finances across thousands of miles with unprecedented speed. This efficiency supercharged the American economy, laying the groundwork for the industrial boom of the late 19th century. The telegraph wasn't just about sending personal telegrams. It was the essential infrastructure of a modern capitalist economy. So, as we look at those old photographs of railroads stretching to the horizon, let's not forget the slender wires running beside them. They represent a revolution just as profound as the one made of iron and steam. The telegraph conquered distance, not with horsepower, but with electricity. It shrank the continent, united a nation, and redefined the very pace of life itself. It was the first step into the age of instantaneous information, an age we are still living in and shaping today. The legacy of those simple wires and clicking keys is all around us, in the smartphones in our pockets, in the global network that connects us all. Thank you so much for joining me on this leg of our historical journey. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue to create this content for you. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. Until next time, stay curious. Upbeat, adventurous music with a historical feel fades slightly to the background. Hello and welcome back. We return to the windswept expanse of Promontory Summit, Utah, a place on the verge of making history. The date is May 10th, 1869. The air here isn't just thin, it's electric, crackling with an anticipation that has been building for 6 long years across a continent. Imagine the scene. A sea of faces, a diverse crowd of hundreds, perhaps 1,000 people, all gathered under the vast blue Utah sky. There are the hardy, sun-weathered, laborious Chinese, and others the very men who sweat and toil carved this path through mountains and across deserts. Alongside them stand the dignitaries, railroad executives in their finest suits, army officers in crisp uniforms, politicians, reporters, and local settlers. They've all come to this remote plateau to witness a miracle of modern engineering. The ground is still raw, the landscape dotted with the makeshift tents and shacks of a frontier boomtown. But today, this rugged outpost is the absolute center of the American universe. The stage is set for the final act of one of the greatest construction dramas in human history. And at the heart of it all, 2 magnificent machines stand as silent, powerful testaments to this achievement. From the west, representing the Central Pacific Railroad, is the locomotive Jupiter. It's a beautiful engine, an American 440 type, its polished brass gleaming in the sunlight, its tall smokestack pointing proudly to the heavens. The Jupiter has just completed its arduous journey eastward from Sacramento, a symbol of the line that conquered the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. Facing it nose to nose, just a single railroad tie's length away, is the Union Pacific's No. 119. It's another powerful 440. Equally impressive. Having steamed westward from Omaha, across the vast Great Plains and the treacherous Rockies, they are like 2 iron titans, meeting after a long and arduous quest. They aren't just machines. They are the embodiment of 2 powerful forces, 2 halves of a nation, finally coming together. The space between them is tiny, but it represents the final, monumental gap in a nearly tooth-mile-long iron ribbon that will forever change the United States. The crowd presses in, a palpable energy buzzing through them, everyone craning their necks, trying to get a better view of the small, open space on the track, where history is about to be made. The ceremony itself is a mix of formal proceedings and frontier celebration. Speeches are made, prayers are offered, and the sense of accomplishment is overwhelming. This isn't just about laying a track. It's about fulfilling a national dream, a concept known as manifest destiny. It's about binding a country still healing from the deep wounds of the Civil War. This railroad is a physical symbol of unity, a promise of a connected future. And now, the moment everyone has been waiting for arrives. 4 special spikes are presented. There's a gold spike from California, a silver one from Nevada, another of gold, silver, and iron from Arizona, and finally, the most famous of all, the last spike, a 17.6 karat gold spike, also from California. This isn't just hardware, it's jewelry, each one a precious symbol of the wealth and ambition of the West. The final tie, a polished laurel wood tie, is carefully placed into position. The crowd hushes. The pre-drilled holes in the laurel tie are ready to receive these ceremonial spikes. One by one, the dignitaries are invited forward to gently tap them into place with a silver maul. It's a symbolic gesture, a moment of shared triumph. But the true climax, the moment that will echo across the nation, involves an ordinary iron spike and a standard railroad hammer. This is the spike that will actually complete the line, and this hammer is special. It's wired to the telegraph line. Standing ready are 2 of the railroad's most important figures. Leland Stanford, President of the Central Pacific, and Thomas C. Durant, Vice President of the Union Pacific. The plan is audacious and brilliantly modern. As the final spike is driven, the blows of the hammer will be transmitted in real time by telegraph to every major city in the country. From New York to San Francisco, from New Orleans to Chicago, telegraph operators are waiting, listening intently. A special message has already gone out. To everybody, keep. When the last spike is driven at Promontory Point, we will say done. Imagine the scene. In offices across the nation, People are gathered around telegraph sounders, holding their breath, waiting for the clicks that will signal the railroad's completion. The entire country is connected to this single, dramatic moment. Leland Stanford raises them all. The crowd is silent, leaning in. He swings and misses the spike, striking the rail instead. Some say Thomas Durant also missed his swing. It's a slightly clumsy, very human moment amidst the grandeur, a reminder of the imperfect, striving nature of the whole enterprise. But it doesn't matter. The telegraph operator, Everett the professional, is prepared. He doesn't wait for the sound of the hammer. With perfect timing, he simply taps out the signal himself 3 dots, representing the 3 strikes, and then the single, triumphant word, done. Instantly, the nation erupts. In Washington, D.C., a magnetic ball drops from the Capitol dome. In Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell, which hadn't rung since George Washington's funeral, is tapped. In San Francisco, cannons boom. In Chicago, a 7-mile-long parade begins. Across the country, church bells ring, fire whistles shriek, and citizens celebrate in the streets. It's a nationwide party, a collective sigh of relief and a roar of the continent has been conquered by iron and steam. Back at Promontory Summit, the celebration is more immediate and rock as the locomotives, Jupiter and No. 119 slowly inch forward until their cowcatchers touch. Like a mechanical kiss, the crowd goes wild. Champagne flows, toasts are made, and photographers like Andrew J. Russell scramble to capture the iconic images that will define this day for posterity. The famous champagne photo, showing engineers from both lines toasting each other from their locomotives, perfectly captures the spirit of reunion and shared success. The ceremonial spikes are quickly removed and replaced with a standard iron one, and the real work of a functioning railroad begins almost immediately. But the symbolism of the golden spike ceremony is what endures. It marks the end of the frontier era in many ways. The 6-month perilous journey by wagon or ship from the East Coast to the West Coast is now reduced to about a week of relative comfort and safety. The railroad would accelerate settlement, boost commerce, and irrevocably tie the nation's economic and political fortunes together. It was a hinge point in American history, and it all culminated here, in this remote Utah valley, with a swing of a hammer and the simple, powerful word done. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is a saga of vision, of struggle, and of incredible human effort. From the dreamers who first conceived it, to the politicians who financed it, to the thousands of laborers who built it, it represents a monumental achievement against staggering odds. The Golden Spike wasn't just the end of construction. It was the beginning of a new chapter for America. It stitched the country together with threads of steel, paving the way for the modern nation we know today. The challenges were immense brutal weather, treacherous terrain, financial crises, and immense human cost, but the will to connect the continent proved stronger. This single railway line became the artery through which the lifeblood of a young, ambitious nation would flow, carrying people, goods, and ideas from sea to shining sea. It transformed the landscape, the economy, and the very identity of the United States, and the echo of that final hammer blow at Promontory Summit continues to resonate, a testament to what can be accomplished when vision and determination come together. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through history. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more stories like this one, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring these pivotal moments from the past to life. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through the moments that shaped America. Today, we're diving into Chapter 16. A nation united. Imagine a time when crossing the country wasn't a matter of hours, but a grueling, months-long ordeal. A letter sent from New York might not reach California for half a year. The vast expanse of the continent was more than just a physical distance. It was a barrier that kept people, ideas, and opportunities apart. But that was all about to change, thanks to one of the most monumental achievements in American history, the Transcontinental Railroad. Before its completion, the journey west was a perilous adventure. Families braved treacherous trails, facing harsh weather, unforgiving landscapes, and constant uncertainty. Businesses struggled to expand, their reach limited by this slow, unreliable pace of wagons and ships sailing around the tip of South America. The nation, while technically one country, felt like two separate worlds, the established East and the wild, distant West. This physical separation fostered different cultures, economies, and perspectives, making the idea of a truly United States feel more like an aspiration than a reality. Then, in a flurry of iron, sweat, and sheer determination, everything shifted. The dream of connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific by rail became a national obsession. Two companies, the Central Pacific, starting from Sacramento, California, and the Union Pacific, starting from Omaha, Nebraska, began a legendary race. They were building towards each other, laying track through some of the most challenging terrain imaginable. They blasted through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains and spanned the vast, empty plains of the heartland. Thousands of workers, including Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and a huge workforce of Chinese laborers, toiled under brutal conditions to lay mile after mile of track. It was an epic undertaking, a symbol of post-Civil War ambition and a testament to human endurance. And then, on May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the two lines met. A golden spike was ceremoniously driven to mark the completion of the track. A simple telegraph message flashed across the nation. Done. It was a single word that heralded a new era. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. The journey that once took 6 agonizing months was slashed to a mere week. Think about that for a second. What was once a life-altering expedition became a manageable trip. The continent had effectively shrunk. This wasn't just about faster travel. It was about collapsing the distance that had defined America for so long. The impact was immediate and profound. Mail, once a precious and slow-moving commodity, could now cross the country in days. Imagine the joy of a family in San Francisco receiving a letter from their loved ones in Boston in a fraction of the time it used to take. This rapid communication stitched the country together, weaving a network of shared news and personal stories that had never existed before. Newspapers from the East could now be read in the West, while the stories were still fresh. Information, ideas, and opinions traveled at an unprecedented speed, helping to create a more unified national conversation and a shared American identity. It was a revolution for commerce, too. Goods that were once luxuries on the West Coast, shipped at great expense, could now be transported affordably and quickly by rail. California fruit could reach New York markets, while manufactured goods from Eastern factories could supply the growing towns of the West. This created a truly national economy. Businesses boomed, new markets opened up, and industries from farming to mining to manufacturing flourished, all fueled by the lifeblood of the railroad. Towns and cities sprouted up all along the railway lines, turning desolate prairies into bustling hubs of activity and opportunity. The railroad wasn't just a track. It was an engine of growth that powered the nation's economic expansion for decades to come. But perhaps the most heartwarming effect was on a personal level. Families, separated by thousands of miles, and the daunting prospect of the westward journey, could now be reached. A son who had gone west to seek his fortune could now visit his parents back east. A sister could travel to her brother's wedding across the country. These were connections that had been strained or severed by distance, and the railroad mended them. It brought people together, strengthening the personal bonds that are the true fabric of any nation. The sight of a train pulling into a station wasn't just about the arrival of goods. It was about the arrival of a loved one, a friend, a family member. It was a sound of reunion. With this newfound connectivity, America began to feel smaller, more intimate, and more cohesive. People from different regions interacted more than ever before. A traveler from Massachusetts could share a train car with a miner from Nevada, a farmer from Nebraska, and a merchant from Chicago. They shared stories, exchanged ideas, and learned about each other's lives. These interactions helped to break down regional prejudices and build a sense of common purpose and shared destiny. The railroad was the physical manifestation of the motto E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It was the iron thread that bound a diverse and sprawling country into a single, interconnected nation. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was more than just an engineering feat. It was a defining moment that reshaped the American landscape, economy, and soul. It accelerated westward expansion, fueled industrial growth, and, most importantly, brought a nation closer together. The era of the isolated frontier was over, replaced by an age of connection and national unity. The whistle of the locomotive echoing across the plains was the sound of a promise, fulfilled the promise of a truly United States of America. Thank you so much for joining me on this look back into a pivotal chapter of history. It's incredible to see how one project could so drastically change the course of a nation. If you enjoy this video and want to explore more stories that shaped our world, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our historical journey through the American West. Today, we're diving into Chapter 17, a pivotal and often somber chapter in this story. The profound impact of westward expansion on Native Americans. As we've seen, the 19th century was a time of unprecedented growth and change for the United States, but this progress, as it was called, came at an immense cost for the indigenous peoples who had called these lands home for millennia. So, let's take a respectful and honest look at this complex period. Imagine vast, open plains stretching as far as the eye can see, teeming with millions of buffalo. For countless generations, these herds were the lifeblood of the Plains tribes. They provided everything: food, shelter, clothing, tools, and spiritual sustenance. The buffalo was central to their entire way of life, a sacred gift from the Creator. Their existence was woven into the natural rhythms of the land, a delicate balance honed over centuries. This wasn't just a resource, it was the foundation of their culture, their economy, and their very identity. Now, picture a new force thundering across this landscape. The railroad, iron horses, as they were called, carving lines across the continent. For the expanding United States, these railroads were a symbol of manifest destiny, of connecting a nation from coast to coast. They were arteries of commerce, carrying goods, resources, and something else: settlers. Trainloads of pioneers, miners, and ranchers, all seeking a new life, a piece of land to call their own. The government encouraged this migration, offering land through acts like the Homestead Act, fueling a relentless wave of settlement. But this new artery of progress cut directly through the heart of Native American lands and, crucially, through the migratory paths of the buffalo. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The once mighty herds were split, their ancient roots blocked by iron rails. This disruption was not just an unfortunate side effect. It became a deliberate strategy. The railroad brought sport hunters who would shoot buffalo from train windows for fun, leaving carcasses to rot on the plains. More strategically, the U.S. Army and government officials recognized that controlling the buffalo meant controlling the Plains tribes. General Philip Sheridan famously said, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." The systematic slaughter of the buffalo is, in effect, a campaign to destroy the Native American way of life, to sever their connection to the land and force them into submission. Within a few short decades, the herds that once numbered in the tens of millions were reduced to a few hundred, and the independence of the Plains people, crumbled. As settlers poured into the West, clashes with native tribes became inevitable. These weren't empty lands. They were ancestral territories, hunting grounds, and sacred sites. These settlers, backed by the U.S. military, saw the land as theirs for the taking. Treaties were made, but they were often negotiated under duress, misunderstood due to language barriers, and almost universally broken by the U.S. government as soon as more land or resources were desired. Think of the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, a sacred area guaranteed to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. By the Fort Laramie Treaty, the treaty was simply ignored, triggering the Great Sioux War of 1876. This pattern of broken promises and escalating violence repeated across the West. Conflicts like the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and the tragic Wounded Knee Massacre are stark reminders of the brutality of this era. The U.S. military, with its superior firepower and resources, was dispatched to pacify the West, which meant forcing Native Americans onto smaller and smaller parcels of land known as reservations. These forced relocations were devastating. Tribes were moved to lands often unsuitable for farming, far from their ancestral homes, and stripped of their traditional means of survival. The Long Walk of the Navajo and the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee are infamous examples of these brutal, forced marches where thousands perished from starvation, disease, and exposure. Confined to reservations, Native Americans became dependent on government rations, which were often insufficient and of poor quality. Their spiritual practices were outlawed, and their children were often taken from them and sent to boarding schools. The goal of these boarding schools was explicit: kill the Indian, save the man. Children were forced to cut their hair, abandon their native languages, and forsake their cultural identities. They were taught to assimilate into white American society, a policy that caused deep intergenerational trauma that communities are still healing from today. This wasn't just a loss of land, it was a systematic attempt to erase entire cultures. So, as we reflect on Chapter 17, it's crucial to understand that the story of westward expansion is a dual narrative. For one group, it was a story of opportunity, bravery, and building a new nation. But for another, it was a story of immense loss, of broken treaties, and the destruction of a way of life. The railroads, the settlers, the disappearance of the buffalo, they were all interconnected parts of a process that irrevocably changed the American West and left a legacy of deep sorrow and injustice. Acknowledging this somber side of our history is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding the full cost of progress and honoring the resilience of the Native American peoples who have survived against all odds and continue to fight to preserve their heritage today. Thank you for joining me for this important discussion. It's a heavy topic, but one we must engage with to have a complete picture of American history. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into our shared past. We'll see you in the next chapter. How did America become the economic powerhouse we know today? It wasn't overnight. In fact, a huge piece of the puzzle can be found in the clatter of steel wheels on steel tracks. Today, we're diving into the massive economic transformation of the late 19th century, a story dominated by the rise of the railroad. Before the railroad, America was a collection of isolated pockets. A farmer in Kansas might grow the best wheat in the world, but it was incredibly difficult and expensive to get it to the bakeries in New York. A miner in Colorado might strike a rich vein of silver, but transporting it to the mint was a monumental task. The railroad changed everything. Suddenly, the vast interior of the continent was connected to the bustling coastal markets. It was like flipping a switch. Think about it from the perspective of a miner. Before the railroad, you were limited by what you and your mules could carry, but with tracks laid nearby, tons of ore could be shipped out, and heavy machinery could be brought in. Mining boomed not just for gold and silver, but for the coal and iron needed to fuel this new industrial age. Entire towns, literally called boom towns, sprang up overnight around these mining operations, all dependent on that steel lifeline. The same revolution happened in agriculture. The Great Plains, the Great American Desert, transformed into the nation's breadbasket. Farmers could now practice commercial agriculture on a massive scale. They knew that a train could take their wheat, corn, and other crops to distant cities, and even to ports for export. This created a reliable market, encouraging more settlement and cultivation. The railroad didn't just transport crops. It transported the very idea of a national agricultural economy. And let's not forget the cowboys. The romantic image of the long cattle drive was a direct result of the railroad. Ranchers in Texas raised vast herds of longhorn cattle. Their goal, get those cattle to the railheads in towns like Abilene, Kansas. From there, the live cattle were shipped in specialized cars to slaughterhouses in cities like Chicago, which became the meatpacking capital of the world. The railroad connected the Texas range to the dinner tables of the East Coast. As the tracks spread, so did civilization. Towns and cities didn't just grow. They exploded in population and importance wherever the railroad went. Look at a map from that era. You'll see new urban centers blooming all along the tracks. These weren't just sleepy whistle stops. They became hubs of commerce, banking, and settlement. Land speculators would buy up property near proposed railway lines, knowing that the value would skyrocket once the trains arrived. The railroad was literally drawing the map of modern America. This incredible growth and connectivity created unimaginable wealth, but this wealth wasn't evenly distributed. It was concentrated in the hands of a few powerful men who controlled the railroads. T.C. Werite railroad barons, names you might recognize, like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, and Leland Stanford. They were the architects of this new system, and they became some of the richest and most influential figures in American history. These barons were brilliant, ruthless, and visionary. They consolidated smaller railroad lines into vast networks that spanned the continent. They used their immense power to influence politics, lobbying for land grants, and favorable legislation. They understood that controlling transportation meant controlling the economy itself. If you were a farmer, you had to pay their rates to ship your grain. If you were a manufacturer, you needed their lines to get your goods to market. The methods they used were often controversial. They formed pools and trusts to fix prices and eliminate competition, ensuring their profits remained high. They engaged in stock market manipulation and political bribery. To many, they were robber barons, exploiting the public and crushing smaller competitors for their own gain. To others, they were captains of industry, whose ambition and genius built the infrastructure that made modern America possible. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. The sheer scale of the railroad enterprise reshaped American capitalism. For the first time, businesses were operating on a truly national scale. This required new forms of corporate organization, management, and finance. The railroad was the nation's first big business. The complexities of managing thousands of miles of track, thousands of employees, and a vast array of rolling stock led to innovations in management that would later be adopted by other industries. Furthermore, the demand for capital to build these railroads was immense. This spurred the growth of investment banking and the New York Stock Exchange. Men like J.P. Morgan made fortunes financing these massive projects, creating a new and powerful link between Wall Street and American industry. The railroad wasn't just a business. It was the engine that powered the entire financial system. So, when we look back at this period of economic transformation, we see the railroad at the center of it all. It connected the resources of the West with the markets of the East. It turned miners, farmers, and ranchers into participants in a global economy. It built cities out of prairie dust and created a new class of ultra-wealthy industrialists. It was a messy, chaotic, and often brutal process, but it laid the steel foundation for the 20th century American economy. The clatter of those wheels was the sound of a new nation being born. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this gave you a new perspective on just how crucial the railroad was to America's story. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're exploring Chapter 19, the legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad. This isn't just a story about tracks and trains. It is about how a line of steel redrew the map of a nation and redefined the American dream. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it was more than just the completion of a massive engineering project. It was a powerful symbol, a testament to American ambition, innovation, and sheer determination. In an era before planes and highways, the idea of crossing a vast, rugged continent in a matter of days instead of months was revolutionary. It captured the imagination of the world and became a tangible representation of manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to stretch from coast to coast. This railroad was a bold declaration that no mountain was too high, no desert too wide to stand in the way of progress. It was America telling itself and the world that it was a nation on the move, unified and unstoppable. But the railroad's legacy goes far beyond symbolism. It fundamentally reshaped the American landscape and its people. Before the railroad, settlement in the West was a slow, arduous trickle. Pioneers faced treacherous journeys by wagon train, battling harsh weather, difficult terrain, and an uncertain future. The railroad changed all of that. Suddenly, the West was open for business, for settlement, for a new life. Towns and cities sprouted up along the tracks like wildflowers after a spring rain. Places that were once remote outposts, Omaha, Cheyenne, Sacramento, blossomed into bustling hubs of commerce and activity. The government, through acts like the Homestead Act, actively encouraged this migration, offering land to those willing to settle and cultivate it. The railroad was the artery that pumped people, goods, and ideas into the heart of the continent. It dictated where new communities would be born, creating a new demographic map that we can still see today. Farmers could now ship their crops to eastern markets. Ranchers could move their cattle, and miners could transport their precious metals. The railroad didn't just connect East and West. It created a truly national economy for the first time. The first Transcontinental Railroad was a monumental achievement, but it was also just the beginning. It served as a blueprint, a proof of concept that inspired a frenzy of railroad construction across the country. Visionaries and entrepreneurs saw the success of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific and thought, we can do that too. And they did. Soon, other lines, like the Northern Pacific, the Southern Pacific, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, were crisscrossing the continent. Each new line built upon the foundation of the first, learning from its successes and its failures. They pushed into new territories, connected more remote areas, and further stitched the nation together. This network of steel became the circulatory system of a growing industrial powerhouse. It fueled economic expansion, allowed for the rapid movement of resources and manufactured goods, and solidified the United States as a continental power. The age of the railroad had truly begun, and it was all sparked by that first audacious line across the plains and mountains. However, to fully understand the legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad, we must look at it with clear eyes. It's a story of both triumph and tragedy. For every story of a homesteader finding a new life, there is a story of conflict and displacement. The railroad's path cut directly through the ancestral lands of numerous Native American tribes. The westward expansion it enabled led to broken treaties, devastating conflicts, and the near destruction of the buffalo herds, which were the lifeblood of the Plains Indians. The promise of a unified nation often came at a terrible cost to its original inhabitants, and we cannot forget the human cost of its construction. The project was built on the backs of thousands of laborers who faced brutal conditions for meager pay. On the Central Pacific side, thousands of Chinese immigrants chiseled and blasted their way through the granite of the Sierra Nevada, facing avalanches, explosions, and deep-seated prejudice. Many lost their lives, their contributions largely ignored by history for over a century. On the Union Pacific side, Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans battled extreme weather and harsh terrain. The memory of the railroad, therefore, is a complex one. It's a celebration of human ingenuity and perseverance, but it's also a solemn reminder of the sacrifices made, the injustices committed, and the lives that were irrevocably changed in the relentless march of progress. It stands as a powerful lesson that a nation's greatest achievements are often built on a foundation of mixed triumphs and sorrows. So, the Transcontinental Railroad is more than just a historical event. It's a living legacy etched into the American landscape and psyche. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we dream big, but also a cautionary tale about the costs of that ambition. It shaped where we live, how our economy grew, and our very identity as a nation. It's a story of connection and division, of opportunity and loss, a mixture of triumph and tragedy that continues to resonate today. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next video. As we draw our journey to a close, picture this: a pair of steel tracks glinting under the vast, open sky, stretching out until they merge into a single vanishing point on the distant horizon. It's a quiet image, almost deceptively simple. Yet, within those parallel lines lies a story of monumental ambition, relentless struggle, and a nation forever changed. This is where our story ends, not with a bang, but with a quiet, enduring hum of history. This silent ribbon of steel is the legacy we've been exploring. It's the final chapter written in iron, a testament to an era when the impossible was just another challenge waiting to be met. The clatter of hammers, the shouts of foremen, the rumble of locomotives all faded into the whispers of the wind sweeping across the plains and through the mountain pass. What remains is this track, a silent witness to the dawn of a new America. Let's travel back for a moment to that pivotal day May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah. In the heart of the celebration, amidst the cheering crowds and popping champagne, stood a small, yet profoundly significant object, the golden spike. Forged from 17.6-karat gold, it was more than just a fancy railroad tie. It was a symbol. It was the final punctuation mark on one of the most audacious engineering feats in human history. When Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific Railroad, swung a silver mole to gently tap that spike into a pre-drilled hole in a polished laurel tie. It was a moment broadcast across the nation by telegraph. The single word, "done," flashed from coast to coast, igniting celebrations in cities and towns all across the country. Bells rang in Philadelphia, cannons fired in San Francisco, and parades filled the streets of Chicago. For a nation still healing from the deep wounds of the Civil War, this was a powerful moment of unity. It was a tangible sign that the United States was, quite literally, bound together once more. But what happened to that famous spike? It wasn't left to the mercy of the elements or souvenir hunters. Immediately after the ceremony, the golden spike, along with the special laurel tie, was removed and replaced with a standard iron spike and wooden tie. Its ceremonial duty was complete. The golden spike was never meant to be a permanent part of the track. Its value was purely symbolic. Today, this relic of history, the very same one that marked the completion of a continent-spanning dream, rests safely at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford University. It's a quiet life for an object that once represented such a thunderous achievement. Looking at it now, behind the protective glass, it's hard to imagine the sheer weight of history it carries. It's a physical link to that dusty, windswept day in Utah. A connection to the moment America's east and west coasts were finally united by rail. Other ceremonial spikes from that day from Nevada, from Arizona, from other dignitaries also found their way into museums and private collections, each a small, glittering fragment of a much larger story. The golden spike itself is a beautiful object, engraved with the names of railroad officials and a prayer for the nation. But as we reflect, we must look beyond the polished gold and the names of the powerful men etched upon it. The true story of the railroad isn't just about presidents and financiers. It's about the hands that laid the track, the backs that bore the weight, and the lives that were poured into every single mile of steel. So, let's turn our thoughts to them, the forgotten architects of this continental masterpiece. The thousands of workers whose names are not engraved on any golden spike but are written into the very landscape of America. Think of the Irish immigrants, men who had fled famine and poverty in their homeland, seeking a new start in a new world. They became the backbone of the Union Pacific, pushing westward from Omaha. They were a boisterous, hard-working, and often unruly force. They laid track across the vast, flat expanse of the Great Plains, enduring scorching summers, brutal winters, and the constant threat of conflict. They lived in rough, mobile camps known as Hell on Wheels, towns that sprang up overnight and disappeared just as quickly, following the progress of the railhead. Their labor was grueling, their lives were hard, but their determination was unbreakable. They graded the land, laid the ties, and hammered the spikes, mile after grueling mile. Then, looked to the west. As the Central Pacific carved its path eastward from Sacramento, it faced a seemingly insurmountable obstacle: the Sierra Nevada mountains. The challenge was so immense that the railroad struggled to find and keep laborers. In a move that would change the course of the project, they turned to a group of people who were largely overlooked and underestimated: Chinese immigrants. Thousands upon thousands of Chinese men, seeking to escape poverty and turmoil in their own country, took on the most dangerous and difficult work. They were paid less than their white counterparts and faced constant prejudice. Yet, it was their incredible ingenuity, discipline, and sheer perseverance that conquered the mountains. They chiseled tunnels through solid granite, often using only hand drills and black powder. They were lowered down sheer cliff faces and wicker baskets to plant explosive charges, a job so perilous that many did not survive. They worked through blizzards and avalanches, in conditions that would have broken lesser spirits. Their contribution was not just significant, it was absolutely essential. Without the Chinese laborers, the Central Pacific's progress would have ground to a halt. And there were others, too, Civil War veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies, finding a new purpose and a sense of camaraderie on the grade. Freed African Americans, seeking economic independence and a life beyond the shadow of slavery. Mormons from Utah, contracted to grade the final stretches through their territory. Each group brought their own hopes, their own histories, and their own sweat to the monumental task. These were the people who truly built the railroad. They were the anonymous heroes of this epic tale. Their stories are often lost to history, their graves unmarked along the route they helped to build. But their legacy is undeniable. It is in every tunnel they blasted, every bridge they erected, and every mile of track that still crisscrosses the continent. When we look at that image of the tracks stretching to the horizon, it is their effort, their sacrifice, and their spirit that we should remember. The golden spike may be the symbol, but the human spirit was the engine. And so, we are left with this final, soft reflection. The completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad wasn't just an engineering event. It was a turning point that sent ripples through every aspect of American life. Ripples that we still feel today. It changed the very concept of time and distance. A journey that once took 6 months by wagon train or a perilous sea voyage around Cape Horn was suddenly reduced to about a week. The vast, intimidating wilderness of the American West was opened up, not just to settlers, but to ideas, to commerce, and to a new national identity. The railroad fueled the second industrial revolution. It allowed raw materials from the West minerals, lumber, and agricultural goods to flow to the factories of the East, and for manufactured goods to flow back in return. It created new markets, new industries, and new fortunes. Cities like Denver, Omaha, and Cheyenne boomed, growing from dusty outposts to thriving hubs of commerce, all because of their connection to the Iron Horse. It forever altered the lives of Native American tribes. The Iron Horse, as they called it, cut through their ancestral lands, disrupted the migratory patterns of the buffalo herds that were central to their way of life, and brought an unstoppable wave of settlers. It was a catalyst for conflict and a tragic chapter in the story of westward expansion, one that we must acknowledge with solemnity. The railroad also stitched the country together culturally. Mail, newspapers, and new ideas could travel with unprecedented speed. A person in San Francisco could read about events in New York just a few days after they happened. It helped to create a shared national conversation and shrink the psychological distance between the coasts. America began to feel less like a collection of disparate regions and more like a single, unified nation. From the way we eat with fresh produce, now able to travel across the country, to the very concept of standardized time zones, which were created by the railroads to manage their complex schedules. The legacy of this project is woven into the fabric of our modern lives. As we end our story, let's return one last time to that quiet image of the tracks disappearing into the horizon. They're more than just steel and wood. They are a monument to human ambition, a symbol of connection, a scar on the landscape, and a lifeline of progress. They represent the dreams of a young nation, eager to fulfill its manifest destiny, and the quiet, often forgotten, sacrifices of the thousands who made that dream a reality. The railroad changed America forever, setting it on a course that would define its future and shape the world we live in today. It is a story of power, of progress, and most importantly, of people. A story written in iron, stretching from one ocean to the other. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the heart of American history. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means the world and helps us continue to explore the past together. Until next time, take care.